Listen to this, and let it sink in. In the brutal winter of 1943, 91,000 German soldiers, the tattered remnants of the Sixth Army, stumbled out of the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, with their hands raised in surrender. 11 years later, long after the victory parades had faded, the peace treaties were signed, and the monumental work of rebuilding a shattered continent had begun, only 5,000 of those men ever walked back into their own living rooms. Think about that for a moment. 5,000. That's it. A mere fraction. Today we're going to follow the harrowing journey of what happened to the other 86,000 and explore the chilling reasons why the few survivors kept rotting in Soviet camps long after the world desperately tried to forget the war they'd just endured. I'm not here to pick sides, not to assign blame in the messy aftermath of a global conflict. My purpose is far simpler, yet perhaps more profound. I'm here to count ghosts. The story you're about to hear isn't just a dusty footnote in some forgotten history book. We'll move quickly, because there's a lot to cover, but we'll do so with fairness and an unflinching gaze. You'll get the stark numbers, the forgotten names, the visceral smells of desperation, and the haunting silences that clung to these men for decades. So brace yourself. The snow gets deep out there, and the rations, as you'll soon find, get terrifyingly thin. Chapter 1. The Cauldron Closes. Picture January 1943. The German Sixth Army, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, found itself ensnared within a rapidly shrinking ring of Soviet steel, caught like a rat in a trap. The temperatures plunged to an unimaginable minus 30 degrees Celsius, or minus 22 Fahrenheit, sometimes even lower, turning every breath into a frozen dagger in the lungs. One by one, the airfields that were their only lifeline fell to the relentless Soviet advance, then even the last desperate airstrip. Adolf Hitler, from the comfort of his distant bunker, broadcasted his infamous delusional order, "Fight to the last bullet." But for many, the last bullet had been fired days ago, or perhaps they'd simply frozen to death trying to load it. On January 31st, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, a man caught between a madman's orders and the grim reality on the ground, finally surrendered. Just 2 days later, on February 2nd, the last scattered pockets of German resistance folded. The Soviet Red Army, in a calculated move, blared propaganda over loudspeakers, promising life and medical aid to any who laid down their arms. And why wouldn't most of the starving, frost-bitten prisoners believe it? They had, after all, been force-fed Nazi propaganda about Soviet brutality for years, painting their enemy as monstrous. But they'd also been fed absolutely nothing for a week, sometimes two. Anything sounded better than slowly starving to death or freezing solid in a bombed-out cellar. So, they shuffled forward. Those who could still move, hands clasped over their heads, their silhouettes stark against the endless white landscape. The columns of defeated men snaked east into the vast, white, unforgiving unknown. This wasn't just a surrender. It was the beginning of a journey into an abyss. Chapter 2. The First Death March. The march to the nearest railheads was, officially, only 40 kilometers. But for these broken men, it stretched into an agonizing 10 days. 40 kilometers. That's roughly the distance of a marathon, but imagine running it in sub-zero temperatures, emaciated, wounded, and without proper clothing. The Soviet guards, many of whom had just fought a brutal war of attrition against these very men, showed little mercy, prodding any stragglers with bayonets, their breath misting in the frigid air. Frostbite quickly claimed exposed flesh, turning ears, fingers, and toes a horrifying, necrotic black. Prisoners, desperate for any scrap of warmth, stripped greatcoats off the frozen corpses of their comrades, swapping sizes in the snow, a macabre marketplace of the dead. Diaries, later discovered or smuggled out, speak of boot soup, a desperate, horrifying concoction where soldiers would boil leather boots until they softened, then chew the leathery scraps until their gums bled, hoping to extract any meager nutrient. The taste, the texture, the sheer indignity of it, it's almost unimaginable. At the initial collection points, Soviet officers, often indifferent and cold, began the grim task of counting heads. The official tally, 91,225. But by the time the last echelon, the final ragged groups of men, reached the trains, the count was already significantly lower, under 89,000. No one bothered to write down the exact numbers of those who perished along the way. No one stopped to dig proper graves. Chapter 3. Boxcars without end. The journey continued, an endless, monotonous nightmare confined within the claustrophobic wooden walls of cattle cars. The dead were simply left behind, often frozen into grotesque poses, becoming part of the vast, white landscape, their sacrifice unacknowledged, their memory erased by the unforgiving elements. 40 men crammed into each, standing shoulder to shoulder, their breath fogging the frigid air. For sanitation, there was a single, crudely cut hole in the floor, an open sewer that offered no privacy and little relief. The stench, a mixture of unwashed bodies, human waste, and despair, was overwhelming. These trains, symbols of their captivity, rolled relentlessly eastward for weeks, sometimes even months, carrying their human cargo deeper into the vastness of the Soviet Union. Bread rations, the very sustenance of life, were a cruel joke. A mere 200 grams, or 0.4 pounds, a day, and only then, if the guard remembered or cared to distribute it. Water was often scarce, further exacerbating the rampant dehydration. Typhus, the ancient scourge of crowded, unhygienic conditions, made its deadly appearance on day 3 of the journey. By day 5, the dead were being stacked like inanimate luggage at the far end of the car, their bodies rigid with cold, their faces frozen in silent screams. A sergeant named Franz Kessler, clinging to a sliver of hope and a desperate need for his existence to be known, painstakingly carved his wife's address into the wooden wall with a belt buckle. His thought, a flicker of defiance in the darkness: if the car was ever burned later, perhaps someone would find it. Perhaps she would know he had thought of her, that he had fought to remember her face until the very end. Before they even glimpsed the gates of any camp, the average prisoner had already lost 20 kilograms, his body a gaunt shadow of its former self, his spirit teetering on the brink. This was not just transportation, it was an active process of physical and psychological dismantling. Chapter 4. Camp, Soviet style. When the seemingly endless tracks finally ended, the journey was far from over. River barges, often repurposed for cargo, hauled the skeletal survivors further still, first up the mighty Volga River, then north towards the forbidding Urals, and then, impossibly, even farther beyond. Officially, these desolate outposts of human suffering were given a bureaucratic euphemism: labor re-education centers. The implication was that these men needed to be worked and taught a new way of thinking. Unofficially, of course, they were nothing more than slices of permafrost, garnished with cruel barbed wire, designed to break body and spirit. The largest and most infamous cluster of these camps was located in Vorkuta, a sprawling coal-mining basin situated deep above the Arctic Circle. Here, summer was a fleeting, almost mythical 2-week reprieve, while winter, with its soul-crushing darkness and relentless cold, stretched for a brutal 8 months. The Geneva Convention, that international agreement designed to protect prisoners of war, simply never reached latitude 67 degrees north. It was as if it didn't exist. Life in these camps revolved around an impossible daily quota: 2 tons of coal per man. The tools provided were rudimentary, often shared. 1 pickaxe for every 3 men, if you were lucky. There were no helmets for protection against falling rock, no boots with proper soles to guard against the crushing cold and jagged terrain. The food, a meager 500 grams of bread and 1 liter of soup, was barely enough to sustain a child. And the quality? If the soup was thin, you drank water, filling your stomach with liquid that offered no calories. If the soup was thick, you chewed on tough cabbage stalks, hoping for some fibrous sustenance. The estimated calories issued daily hovered around 900. The calories burned, however, performing back-breaking labor in the extreme cold, easily exceeded 3,000. The maths, stark and unforgiving, killed quicker than any guard's bullet. It was a slow, systematic extermination by calorie deficit. Chapter 5. The Hunger Year, 1944. A year etched into the memories of the survivors as the Hunger Year. Across the globe, the tide of war was turning, and the Soviet Union was receiving vital Lend-Lease shipments from its Western allies. Sacks of flour, tins of meat, and other foodstuffs rolled past the camp fences, tantalizingly close, yet utterly out of reach, destined for the Red Army. The irony was a bitter pill. The very supplies meant to fight the war were visible to the men starving in its aftermath. For the prisoners, rations plummeted to a terrifying 300 grams a day, a mere whisper of sustenance, barely enough to keep a flicker of life. Doctors among the POWs, themselves barely clinging to life, were forced to perform unimaginable acts of improvisation. Frostbitten toes were amputated with penknives, crude and agonizing procedures. There was no anesthetic, so they would drip ice directly onto the stump, hoping the numbing cold would provide some small relief from the excruciating pain. Rumors of cannibalism, whispered in the dark corners of barracks, began to ripple through the camps, a horrifying testament to the depth of their desperation. Soviet command, predictably, dismissed these whispers as Nazi propaganda. Yet in a telling contradiction, they posted extra machine gun towers around the perimeter, perhaps fearing what desperate men might do. By spring, the prisoner count had dwindled to a chilling 48,000. Roughly half of the remaining men had simply vanished in the span of 12 brutal months. A Soviet political officer, in a diary entry that would later surface, wrote with chilling indifference, "The fascists die like flies. No one at home will notice." It was a stark, dehumanizing assessment, perfectly capturing the Soviet regime's view of these men as disposable resources, their lives utterly without value. The Hunger Year was not just a period of scarcity, it was a deliberate, systematic culling. Chapter 6. War Ends. Bars Stay. May 1945. Berlin fell, Hitler was dead, and across Europe, people poured into the streets, dancing, singing, celebrating the end of the most devastating conflict in human history. The euphoria was palpable, a collective sigh of relief. But inside the Soviet camps, far from the joyous celebrations, loudspeakers crackled to life, delivering a message that crushed any nascent flicker of hope. It was Stalin's chilling order, declaring that all German POWs remain interned for reconstruction work. There was no trial, no sentence, no end date, just indefinite soul-crushing labor. The hope, so fragile and newly kindled, drained faster than the watery soup they were occasionally given. Prisoners, in a desperate attempt to mark time and maintain some semblance of sanity, scratched calendars onto the rough plank walls of their barracks. Some diligently crossed off each passing day, clinging to the illusion of progress. Others, however, stopped at May 8, 1945, the day the war officially ended, and left the rest of their calendars blank. Why count toward nothing? Toward an end that refused to materialize? By the war's end, Soviet captivity officially held an astonishing 2.4 million Germans. The Gulag administration, the vast network of Soviet labor camps, simply merged these German POWs with common criminals, deserters, and Baltic nationalists, stripping them of their military identity, their individuality. You became a mere number, prefixed with a G for German, a bureaucratic label that further dehumanized you. Letters home were permitted, a cruel tease of connection. 10 lines, pencil only, once a month. But most never arrived. The censorship quota was a grim joke. 2 sacks of mail per camp, per quarter. Everything else, the countless letters filled with longing and desperation, became free heating for the guards, tossed into stoves without a second glance. The bars remained, not just physically, but psychologically, trapping them in a limbo that felt like an eternity. Chapter 7. The 5,000 Who Bent But Didn't Break. Fast forward to 1947. A subtle, almost imperceptible shift began to occur. Typhus, while still a threat, receded somewhat, its deadly grip loosening marginally. Rations, still woefully inadequate, inched up to 700 grams. And a new telling category began to appear on camp rosters, fit for light labor only. These were the men who, against all odds, had survived the brutal hunger gap of 1944, the typhus wave that swept through the camps and the -40 nights that claimed so many. They were living, breathing miracles. Their average weight was a skeletal 45 kilograms, their bodies ravaged by years of starvation and hardship. Their average age was 28, yet they looked 50, their faces etched with lines of suffering, their eyes hollow and ancient. Among this dwindling number were figures like Friedrich von Paulus, nephew of the infamous Field Marshal, who carried a stark reminder of his ordeal. 3 fingers lost to a mine. There was Emil Schulze, a baker from Dresden, a resourceful man who traded precious bread crusts for Russian lessons, a skill he instinctively knew he would need later, a small gamble on a future that seemed impossible. And then there was Klaus, the fiancé of Gertrude Traudel-Adler, who kept her faded photo tucked under his inmate tag, the ink slowly dissolving with every wash day, a silent testament to enduring love and a hope that refused to die. These men learned the most profound lessons in survival, which weeds were edible, which guards could be swayed by intricately carved wooden toys, and how to sleep in shifts so that the weakest among them could claim the warmest spot near the precious, often meager stove. They formed 1,000-day clubs, a grim but hopeful pact. If you were still breathing after 1,000 sunrises in captivity, you earned a single cigarette, painstakingly saved from the infirmary. It was a small symbolic reward for an immense feat of endurance. By 1950, the camp mortality rate, which had once been catastrophic, finally dropped below 5%. The number on the rosters, a stark, sobering figure, was just under 5,000. These were the ones who, though bent and broken in body, had refused to break in spirit. Chapter 8. Why Moscow Kept Them. So the war was over. Years had passed, and yet Moscow clung to these men. Why not simply send them home? The answer, as revealed in Soviet memos declassified decades later, wasn't simple humanitarianism or oversight. It was a cold, calculated strategy, driven by 4 primary reasons. Reason 1. Labor gap. The Soviet Union had suffered catastrophic losses during the war, an estimated 15 million working-age citizens. Its cities lay in ruins, its industries decimated. German backs, disciplined and broken, were seen as cheap, readily available replacements for the lost workforce. They were forced to rebuild the very infrastructure they had helped destroy, a bitter irony. The economic devastation of the USSR was immense, and these POWs represented a vast, unpaid labor force for its reconstruction. Reason 2. Leverage. In the nascent years of the Cold War, holding hundreds of thousands of German POWs gave the Soviet Union significant political and economic leverage. It was a bargaining chip. Their continued internment guaranteed that vital reparations, particularly coal and machinery, would keep flowing from the west to the east. It was a constant pressure point on the fledgling West German state and its Western allies, a reminder of Soviet power and demands. Reason 3. Propaganda. For the home audience, the Soviet people who had endured immense suffering, the continued internment of Hitlerites, served a powerful propaganda purpose. It showed that the enemy was still paying penance, that justice was being exacted, and that the sacrifices of the Soviet people had not been in vain. It reinforced the narrative of the fascist aggressor being brought to heel, a visible symbol of their victory. Reason 4. Paranoia. Stalin, ever the paranoid dictator, harbored deep suspicions. He genuinely believed that any returning German soldier, especially one who had fought on the Eastern Front, could potentially spearhead a revived Wehrmacht, a new German military threat. Better, he reasoned, to keep them where they couldn't march, where they couldn't organize, where they couldn't pose any future threat to Soviet security. It was a testament to his enduring distrust and a desire to control every conceivable variable. Repatriation, when it finally began, happened in frustrating dribs and drabs. The first to be released were often the cripples, those too broken to be useful, a cynical gesture. Then came the born-again communists, those who had seemingly embraced Soviet ideology, deemed safe enough to return. Each individual release required a signature from the highest echelons of the Politburo, a testament to the centralized and bureaucratic nature of the decision-making process. The queue for freedom was glacier slow, each day an eternity. Chapter 9. Homecoming, Piecemeal. 1948-49. A glimmer of hope, a faint light at the end of an impossibly long tunnel. The first major wave of repatriations began, about 600 men, a mere trickle compared to the millions still held. West German radio, starved for good news, optimistically dubbed it the thaw. Families, their hearts a mixture of trepidation and desperate hope, gathered at Friedland Camp, the central reception point for returning POWs. They clutched faded photographs, hand-drawn portraits, and paper tags inscribed with a single heartbreaking word: Papa? But the reality of these reunions was often brutal. Many children, now years older, simply walked past their own fathers, not recognizing the gaunt, aged skeletons who emerged from the trains. The men were ghosts, unrecognizable shadows of the vibrant individuals they once were. 1950-52 saw a second wave, another 1,000 men released. But this wasn't a humanitarian gesture. These releases were often directly linked to West Germany signing crucial trade deals for potash and steel pipe, a cynical exchange of human lives for economic gain. Then came 1953. Joseph Stalin died, and with his death, a slight softening of the rigid Soviet stance. Georgy Malenkov, his immediate successor, signaled a willingness to let the old ones go. Yet even then, releases hinged on the whims and needs of local camp commanders, who often stalled repatriations to ensure their coal quotas were met. It was a bureaucratic nightmare, a cruel game of cat and mouse. Finally, in September 1955, Konrad Adenauer, the formidable Chancellor of West Germany, flew to Moscow. He engaged in high-stakes diplomacy, culminating in the signing of a pivotal trade and release accord. He landed back in Cologne, not with a treaty, but with a list, 9,626 names. Among them, a staggering 4,999 were identified as survivors from the hell of Stalingrad. One more, Klaus Adler, the man who clung to his fiancée's fading photo, followed in December after a mandatory hospital stay. The press, eager for a neat narrative, rounded it up. Chapter 10. What they carried back. They stepped off the planes, these 5,000, looking alien in Soviet-issue coats 4 sizes too big, their gaunt frames swimming in the coarse fabric. Their pockets, however, were not empty. They were stuffed with the paltry remnants of their captivity, objects that had taken on immense, almost sacred meaning. A tin cup. Almost every man kept his tin cup. It was more than just a drinking vessel. It was the tangible difference between drinking and drowning in soup, a symbol of basic sustenance in a world of deprivation. It was a constant companion, a silent witness. A spoon carved from birch. Often crudely fashioned, with initials still visible, painstakingly carved during moments of quiet desperation. It was a piece of their own making, a connection to craftsmanship in a world devoid of beauty. Crumpled camp money. 10 rubles, perhaps, utterly worthless outside the barbed wire fence. But it was proof. Proof that it wasn't a dream, that the years of suffering had been real, a tangible piece of an existence that many would struggle to believe. And silence. This was the heaviest burden of all, the most profound thing they carried back. A deep, unyielding silence born of unspeakable trauma. West German doctors examining these returning men were confronted with a litany of horrors. The tuberculosis rate was a staggering 30%. Heart damage afflicted 60%, their organs ravaged by years of malnutrition and stress. Night blindness, a symptom of severe vitamin deficiency, affected 80%, leaving them literally in the dark.
Psychologists, grappling with the unprecedented scale and nature of their suffering, had to invent a new term: chronic captivity syndrome. It manifested as jumpiness at the sound of railway whistles, an inability to ever throw away food crusts, a compulsive need to hide scraps under floorboards, behaviors ingrained by years of starvation and terror. Many marriages, already fragile from years of separation and the unspoken horrors, buckled under the strain.
Families rebuilt on paper, idealized during long years of longing, simply couldn't survive the harsh reality of real kitchens, real bedrooms, and the silent, haunted men who now inhabited them. Employers, caught in the throes of Germany's economic miracle, would often ask, with a casual indifference that stung more than any physical blow, 10 years lost, what skills do you have? The answer, often delivered with a bitter irony, was stark. Mining in -40. Got vacancies? Some survivors became night watchmen, finding solace in solitude and the quiet of the dark. Others, still grappling with their past, became ghostwriters for memoirs that nobody wanted to buy, their stories too grim, too uncomfortable for a nation eager to look forward. A defiant few even joined the new West German army, teaching mine warfare to 19-year-olds who, tragically, thought Stalingrad was merely a brand of vodka. They carried back not just physical scars, but an invisible weight that would shape the rest of their lives. Chapter 11. The Ones Who Never Came Back. Let's not forget them. Let's speak for the 86,000, the vast majority who never saw home again. The official cause of death records list clinical terms: starvation, dysentery, mine blast, execution for sabotage, heart failure. But the reality, the brutal overarching truth, is far simpler and more profound. Captivity itself killed them. It was a slow, agonizing process, a systematic erosion of life. A Soviet guard's diary, auctioned in 2019, offered a chilling, matter-of-fact glimpse into their fate. We bury them in pits of 40, ground too hard to dig individual graves, their tags rust, the numbers peel off. Imagine the dehumanization, the sheer anonymity of it. 40 men, tossed into a frozen pit, their identities dissolving with their dog tags. In the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russian and German teams, fueled by a belated sense of historical duty, began to exhume mass grave sites near Vorkuta. They searched for answers, for identities. DNA technology, advanced by then, could still match some remains to families, but the vast majority of tags were long gone, rusted away, or never even existed. The total identified, painstakingly, one by one, fewer than 4,000. The rest, an untold number, lie scattered and anonymous under the permafrost and taiga, as countless and unremembered as the snow that buried them. Their names, their stories, lost to the vast, unforgiving landscape. Conclusion. So, 5,000 made it home. 1 in 18. A terrifying ratio. They returned to a country desperately patching its rubble with Marshall Plan dollars, a nation eager to look forward, to embrace the future, not back into the painful abyss of its recent past. The survivors, often feeling like strangers in their own land, formed a quiet association, a brotherhood of shared trauma. They met once a year, shared lukewarm coffee and tin-cup jokes that no outsider could ever truly understand. By 2005, only 32 were left, their ranks thinned by time and the lingering effects of their ordeal. Today, perhaps only 2 remain, living echoes of a forgotten tragedy. Their memoirs, when they manage to write them, sit on library shelves, spines often uncracked, their stories deemed too grim, too uncomfortable for a generation that preferred to forget. But the math, the stark, brutal arithmetic of their suffering, still screams its silent message. Every hour you spent watching this, 100 of them never left the frozen steppe. If you remember anything from this story, remember the ratio, 91,000 down to 5,000. And perhaps, just perhaps, next time someone shrugs off the horrors of conflict with a dismissive "war is war," you'll have the numbers ready. History isn't just about what we won, or the grand narratives of triumph. It's also profoundly about who we lost, the unimaginable cost, and how quickly we, as humans, are prone to forgetting. If you want more stories the textbooks skipped, the ones that truly reveal the human cost of history, hit subscribe and ring that bell. Trust me, history's hiding plenty more. And if your family's got a Stalingrad connection, or any story from this forgotten chapter, drop a comment below. The algorithm loves memory, and so do I.